Hiya. So I'm a youth worker, so I want to invite you to start. I want to start this talk by doing what I would do in session. So I just want you to close your eyes for a quick second again. Take a nice big belly breath. I do this with my young people all the time. We have heard some really fascinating stories today, but also they have been heavy on our hearts. So let's breathe. And out. And that was mostly for me. So thank you. Thanks for sharing that moment with me. So the topic I'm here to talk to you about is often presented as a riddle: street violence or knife crime. And this sort of violence that affects young people often gets posed to society as like an extremely difficult riddle with only a select few having the answers. But we can all solve a riddle once we've had a few moments to think about it, right? I mean, we just did. We really, literally just did. So violence that affects young people comes in so many shapes and forms. But what I'm referring to today when I speak about violence is street violence or knife crime such as stabbings. Fighting, carrying knives, guns, or other weapons too. And I just want to put this social issue into context. In 2021, 30 young people were killed in London by being stabbed. That is a classroom of young people robbed of their lives. That is just unacceptable to me. Violence affecting young people is a huge societal problem, and I'm here to talk to you about the causes and what we can do in the face of this. So you might be wondering why I'm using the slightly more long-winded language of young people affected by violence rather than the term you may often hear in the news or in literature about knife crime, youth violence. The term youth violence implies a level of blame towards young people that is quintessential to move away from when we are trying to make impactful change in our society and trying to reduce this violence. It implies blame because the term draws our mind straight to connecting young people with violence rather than really just allowing us to pause and think about how do young people become involved and affected by violence in the first place. So as a youth worker, I just know that no young person is intrinsically violent. The youth are not violent and the youth are not to blame. This binary of good and bad, that doesn't exist. There are young people who have made mistakes, most often as a result of their backgrounds, which can act as a driver. But what I see firsthand through my work with young people is that no one holds these mistakes with pride. They hold them with like a sense of shame and something to learn from and hopefully not repeat. Young people need spaces to process and learn and grow away from violent mistakes. So when we use language that implies blame, we create cycles of anger, shame, and guilt that just stops young people from moving forward from violence in their past. One of the most important violence reduction strategies that I find in my work is empathy. It's about being understanding about the causes of violence, knowing that all young people can have alternative futures away from violence, and really just giving them the space to learn and grow. I really, really believe this. I really think that the answers and solutions to violence affecting young people are based on a society that have the core values of love, compassion, and empathy. So changing our use of language when we think about young people who are affected by violence can help us and those around us change our attitudes towards these young people. Because at the end of the day, if you keep telling someone that X, Y, and Z, they're eventually going to become that. Sorry, excuse me. So what are the causes of violence in our communities? Understanding how young people are affected by violence means zooming our lens out and looking at the causes of violence as emblematic of social, political, and economic conditions that create circumstances in which violence becomes an acceptable and at times necessary for certain people mode of expression. Violence that affects young people is a public health issue. So the Royal College of Nursing explains that public health refers to all organised measures to prevent disease, promote health, and prolong life. Violence in our communities that affects young people, in turn, decreases the life expectancies of people. It causes damage to mental and physical health, and it demotes the health of the population as a whole. This is why I'm saying that violence affecting young people is a public health issue. So we can take a public health approach, is what that means. And taking a public health approach to the issue of violence affecting young people places an emphasis on addressing the root causes of violence. And when we unpack these, which I'm about to, we'll see that the root causes is often a consequence of social factors and adverse childhood experiences. I'm not going to talk to you about adverse childhood experiences today, I'm just going to talk to you about the social factors. So let's delve in. One of the places we often see young people being affected by violence is in economically deprived areas. Look, there's no two ways about it. Poverty is one of the biggest factors that contribute to the occurrence of violence. Poverty leads to extreme marginalization. I see this so often in my work. Most of the regions where I deliver street doctors' violence reduction programs are in economically deprived areas. Poverty and living in impoverished areas decreases young people's ability to see aspirations. The young people I've worked with, for example, are so acutely aware of the stringent circumstances that their families live under. And this is always due to poverty and austerity measures. In this way, involvement in violence can stem from trying to better their situations or to contribute to the home. Poverty breeds necessity, and necessity looks like going to any means possible to put food on your family's table. There's also a link between the lack of good quality housing and, let's be frank, emphasis on good quality, because if you're living in a home with mold, the water being shut off, not being able to heat the house, all of this is going to impact your well-being massively. If we look at this alongside the lack of other vital resources necessary for well-being, such as access to food, clothes, electricity, we push young people in these circumstances to the abject. And these conditions have literally just been shown and researched to increase vulnerability to violence. These are called structural harms. And these structural harms are too often internalised and kind of act to normalise the violence that affects young people. Structural harms that I'm referring to are the harms that are caused by measures such as austerity, rising gas prices, lack of employment, racism, sexism, and social exclusion. Research carried out by Centrepoint, which is a homelessness charity, found that many young people involved in violence have experienced insecure housing or homelessness. Involvement in gang activity, for example, that often becomes an option when work is scarce or unattainable due to lack of qualifications, is spurred by a need to put a roof over your head. And look, I am not saying that all violence affecting young people only occurs in gangs, because it really doesn't. But I'm saying that the reason that young people are often driven to this point, well, it stems from necessity rather than choice. Societal exclusions that structural harms cause also include school exclusions that adversely affect young people. This is because school exclusions disrupt young people's stability. Young people report that school exclusions make them feel demoralised and written off. And I mean, if you're excluded from society or school, wouldn't you feel demoralised or written off? I know I would. It can also place stress on young people's relationships at home and within their friendship groups. When school exclusions happen, it makes young people vulnerable to exploitation. This also inhibits education, further limiting prospects. This is how cycles of violence affecting young people are born. This cycle keeps feeding itself because there is a never-ending break in the circumstances caused by social and economic deprivation. So, a lot of what I've just talked about can make us feel like violence is inevitable. However, as someone whose work is centred around violence reduction and with young people, I really want to assure you that violence is not inevitable and there are solutions. So you might be thinking, what can we do to reduce violence in our communities? Well, many people feel like reducing violence that affects young people lies in more policing and measures based in punishment to deter young people from becoming involved in violence in the first place. But this is actually what we've been doing up until now. And as a youth worker, I can just really attest to the fact that this does not work. Incarceration and school exclusions as a consequence of becoming involved in violence do not reduce violence. Instead, they actually perpetuate the circumstances in which violence affecting young people increases. This is because when we send a young person to prison for being involved in violence, we push them further to the margins. We worsen their circumstances. Rather than providing an intervention that allows young people to recover from their experience of violence, we isolate them and we exclude them. And no one can heal in isolation. So I am going to talk about transformative justice, and I want to state the case for transformative justice when we are thinking about young people affected by violence. Mia Mingus, an American community organizer who runs Transform Harm and has worked with the likes of Angela Davis, beautifully explains transformative justice. So I'm going to use her words, not mine. She says that transformative justice approaches and responds to harm and violence without creating more harm and violence. Transformative justice in action as an approach recognises that state responses to violence reproduce violence and often traumatise those who are exposed to them, especially oppressed communities who are already targeted by the state. It's so important to remember that many communities can't just call the police because of reasons such as fear of deportation, harassment, state-sanctioned violence, sexual violence, previous convictions, or just inaccessibility. For example, my grandma, who only speaks Gujarati, she's not going to be able to call the police. What's she going to say to them? They're not going to be able to translate for her. So let's put this in the context of violence affecting young people. Transformative justice then would look like culturally competent therapeutic interventions, and that means funding services that allow young people to access therapy for free. It means support to families and households. And by support, I don't just mean like emotional support, I mean real financial support, showing up with money for people who are living in poverty. It means hiring therapists who understand the causes of violence that are interconnected to these structural harms that I referred to, and they can create, and allowing them and training them to create spaces where young people can process their feelings of anger without retaliation. Like just a complete end to the imprisoning of young people, a complete end to school exclusions, stop isolating young people, abolish these prisons. An increase in services to reduce violence, such as the work carried out by my charity, Street Doctors. Let me tell you a little bit about what I do and how I focus on violence reduction. So I run a program called Stepwise that works with young people over an extended period of time. The focus of my work is to provide young people with life-saving emergency skills. So young people learn what to do if someone has been stabbed and is bleeding, and what to do if someone has been knocked out. The program allows young people, regardless of their background, to learn what can be done if they ever encounter violence, and how to step up in their communities. My work also provides young people, we do a lot of social and emotional learning. We take a look at skills of how to deal with fight or flight. We look at careers that they could potentially go into. We have exposure to medical professionals, and that allows young people to build trust with that institution, because there is a lack of trust between doctors and young people right now. We have sessions on legal rights, such as what to do if you've been stopped and searched, and so much more. But also we play a lot of basketball, and the young people absolutely rinse me. So this is one way we can make an intervention that is not based around punishment. A lot of the young people I've worked with have had experiences of violence, but nothing about what I do focuses on their past. We look at what we can do in their future. And you might be wondering, well, Krish, I'm not a qualified youth worker. What can I do? And I just want to tell you there is plenty, and let's get into that. So I've already mentioned language and shifting the blame from young people to actually thinking about the societal causes. But right now, I'm standing before an audience who has the ability to make a real difference. Because these issues affect young people, well, they affect you too. Where our taxation goes to fund policing and detention, which clearly isn't working, means less money going into our communities. The more money on a police budget might make you feel safer, but in reality, it hasn't actually made anything safer. Violence still continues to exist in our societies. Research shows that more money spent on imprisoning young people doesn't put an end to violence, with reoffending rates showing how ineffective imprisonment actually is. So you can support solutions which will actually reduce violence and support young people through your voting choices, for example. You can write to your MP. You can attend protests against inflating the police budget that is being increased, by the way, this year to 1.1 billion, whilst youth services continue to face cuts totaling around 1 billion over the last 7 years. So you can show up, you can fight. But really, young people and you have so much to stand for and benefit from in reducing poverty through overhauling austerity measures. This can look like shining a light on housing issues and placing pressure on local authorities and housing associations through email and Twitter campaigns. And if you want a blueprint for this, because there are a lot of students in the room, look at Quajo Housing on Twitter. He is doing incredible work. It can look like donating your time and money to local housing advocates. It can look like urging your local government to fund communities with youth workers like me. Please keep me in a job, I would love that. Adventure playgrounds, youth clubs, and just general safe spaces for young people to turn to. It can even be as simple as helping to create these spaces in the first place through volunteer organisations. So you can be a part of this solution too, if you are one of those people who is lucky enough to be very wealthy. You can redistribute your own wealth if you want to. If you're lucky enough to have more than other people, put that money back into the community's pockets. And it can really just mean advocating for young people through your own political choices. You might think, well, why does this issue affect me? And why should I care? And earlier in this talk, I said that we're all connected. So if we're to think about this in really practical terms, one thing that ties us together is how our government money is spent. If we were to combine a public health approach to reduce violence with transformative justice solutions underlying it, we can truly change how our state spends money, investing in breaking cycles of trauma and poverty and investing in young people themselves. Listening to what young people have to say, because we need to include them in all the decisions we make, and creating a better future for all of us. So just take my speech as a call to action, because really you can do something. I guarantee you can. Find a cause, research it, think about it, and get involved. Thank you so much for your time.